Effect of plyometric versus dynamic weight training on the energy cost of running. Department of Kinesiology, Exercise Physiology, Laboratory, University of Montreal, Montreal, Canada, and Faculty of Sports Sciences, University of Poitiers, Poitiers, France. Abstract. Effect of plyometric versus dynamic weight training on the energy cost of running. Journal Strength and Conditioning Research 24/7, 1818 through 1825, 2010. The purpose of the study is to compare the effects of two strength training methods on the energy cost of running. 35 moderately to well-trained male endurance runners were randomly assigned to either a control group, C, or two intervention groups. All groups performed the same endurance training program during an 8-week period. Intervention groups added a weekly strength training session designed to improve neuromuscular qualities. Sessions were matched for volume and intensity using either plyometric training, PT, or purely concentric contractions with added weight, dynamic weight training, DWT. They found an interaction between time and group and an effect of time for C. Plyometric training induced a larger decrease of C than DWT, whereas it remained unchanged in C. Pre to post changes in C were correlated with initial CR. Peak vertical jump height increased significantly for both experimental groups, but not for C control. All groups showed improvements in performance. Plyometric training were more effective than DWT, improving C in moderately to well-trained male endurance runners, showing that athletes and coaches should include explosive strength training in their practices with a particular attention on plyometric exercises. Future research is needed to establish the origin of this adaptation. Keywords: concurrent training, half squat, drop, jump, running performance. Introduction. Successful running performance in long-duration events is directly influenced by maximum oxygen uptake, VO2 max. Fractional use of VO2 max and an energy cost of running, CR10. Although we have been aware of its importance since the 1970s, the state of knowledge about CR is low compared to our understanding of VO2 max, or end. CR is the O2 equivalent of the energy required to run through a given distance at submaximal speed. It is particularly relevant to predict performance in individuals with similar VO2 max and has been acknowledged as one of the multiple determinants of East African runners' dominance in international competitions. CR depends on a complex interplay of factors including training, environment, physiology, biomechanics, anthropometry, and training. Recent research suggests that strength training is one of the most powerful interventions for improving CR. However, because muscular hypertrophy has been shown to interfere with some peripheral aerobic adaptations, it has been suggested that implementations should use strength training methods that emphasize on neural adaptations. Plyometric and dynamic weight training, PT and DWT, fulfill this requirement. Plyometric training involves an eccentric contraction immediately followed by a concentric contraction to allow the muscle to store and recoil elastic energy. Jumps and rebounds are typically used to induce this muscle stretch shortening cycle. Dynamic weight training involves concentric contractions leading to a maximum power output. It generally consists in moving relatively light loads between 30 and 50% of one repetition maximum as fast as possible. The effects of plyometric and DWT, either alone or in combination to decrease CR, has been highlighted in several convergent reports. In a recent study, 8 moderately trained endurance runners improved CR after completed a 6-week program of high-volume, low-intensity plyometric training in concomitance with their usual endurance training. In another study, in which the authors implemented a comparable plyometric training program, they also found a moderate decrease in CR. Other authors replaced 32% of the usual endurance training volume of 12 elite cross-country runners by an explosive strength training program involving both plyometric and DWT. They reported a large decrease in CR, thus confirming the effectiveness of these methods to improve running efficiency. However, To the best of our knowledge, no attempt has been made to determine whether one of these two methods was more appropriate in improving CR. Physiological and practical applications of this issue are important. They could provide evidence-based data to the coach that may help in optimization of the strength training of endurance athletes, and experimental data to the scientists that may contribute to our understanding of the mechanisms underpinning improvements in CR. Excuse me. Therefore, the purpose of the study was to compare the effectiveness of two strength training methods matched for volume and intensity to improve CR in male endurance athletes, because it allows the use of series and parallel elastic components and has therefore the potential for improving the ability of the muscle tendon unit to store and recoil elastic energy. We hypothesized that plyometric training would result in a greater decrease in CR than DWT. Methods. Experimental approach to the problem. After a thorough briefing and medical screening, all participants signed a written statement of informed consent. Once included, they first completed a maximal continuous graded exercise test, session 1, followed by a force velocity test, session 2, and a counter movement jump test and a performance test, session 3. All tests were separated by at least 48 hours and were performed in a 7-day period before and after an 8-week training period. To avoid any residual fatigue induced by recent training, participants were asked to refrain from strenuous activity the day before the test. They were also asked to arrive fully hydrated to the laboratory at least 3 hours after their last meal. No attempt was made to control the content of this meal. After initial testing, participants were randomly assigned to the DWT group or PT group and the control group, C. The groups were matched for age and peak oxygen consumption. There were no initial differences in other dependent variables between groups. Subjects: 35 moderately to well-trained male endurance runners with no history of strength training participated in this study. They were competing at a provincial standard level, 3 to 7 training sessions per week, at distances between 5,000 and 42,195 meters. Their age, stature, body mass index, and sum of skin folds, triceps, biceps, subscapular, and suprailiac were reported in Table 1. The protocol was reviewed and approved by the Research Ethics Board in Health Sciences of the University of Montreal, Canada. Procedures. Exercise testing. Maximal continuous graded exercise test. This test was performed on a motorized treadmill, Quinton, Bothell, Washington, USA, which was calibrated at 8 and 16 kilometers an hour. Gradient is 0. Before each session with an in-house system using an optical sensor connected to an acquisition card. Initial speed was set at 12 kilometers an hour for 6 minutes to determine the energy cost of running, and increased by 0.5 kilometers an hour every minute until exhaustion. The grade was set at 0 throughout the test. The speed of the last completed stage was considered to be the peak treadmill speed, PTS. Oxygen uptake, VO2, was determined continuously on a 15-second basis using an automated cardiopulmonary exercise system, MOXIS AEI Technologies, Naperville, Illinois, USA. Gas analyzers, S3A and CD3A, AEI Technologies, Naperville, Illinois, USA, were calibrated before each test using a gas mixture of known concentrations, 15% oxygen and 5% carbon dioxide and ambient air. Their accuracy was 0.03% for oxygen and 0.02 for carbon dioxide. Data provided by the manufacturer. The turbine was calibrated before its test using a motorized syringe, Vacuum Med, Ventura, California, USA, with an accuracy of plus or minus 1%. The tidal volume was set at 31 and the stroke rate at 40 cycles per minute. Mean VO2 over the last 2 minutes of the initial 6-minute bout was divided by speed to calculate the energy cost of running, CR in milliliters per kg per kilometer. The highest VO2 over the 15-second period during the test was considered as peak oxygen consumption, VO2 peak in milliliters per kg per minute. Force velocity test. This test was performed on a guided squat rack allowing only vertical movement, Atlantis, Laval, Quebec, Canada. When cued, the participant moved from the standing position into a semi-squat position, 90-degree knee flexion, and had to stay motionless for 4 seconds. before flexion and had to stay motionless for 4 seconds before moving the load as fast as possible. 2 consecutive trials were performed per load, with the best reading recorded for further analysis. 3 minutes of passive recovery was given between each load. Maximum average velocity and power were recorded by linking a shuttle to the end part of the bar locked on an infrared sensor. Muskelab, Ergotest, Norway. The accuracy of this electronic device reached the 10 microsecond time resolution with an optical transducer interruption each 3 millimeters of displacement. Average velocity and power were calculated through the whole range of motion used to perform a complete repetition from 90-degree knee flexion to the full extension. Power load curve were plotted during the test. The initial load was 10 kilograms and was increased by 10 kilograms until the flattening of the power load curve and by increments of 5 kilograms afterwards. The test was completed when power decreased during the least 2 consecutive loads. The highest power was considered as peak power, P peak in watts. Counter movement jump test. This test was performed in the laboratory. When cued, the participant made a counter movement jump jumping as high as possible. The hands had to be placed on the hips throughout the entire jump. No specific instruction was given regarding the depth or speed of the counter movement. 3 trials separated by 1 minute of passive recovery were performed. The best one was recorded for further analysis. Vertical jump height was calculated from flight time using basic kinematic equations. Flight time was recorded with an optical system consisting of 2 bars placed opposite of each other and connected to a PC via the serial port. OptoJump Microgate, Bazzano, Italy. This system transmits an infrared light 1 through 2 millimeters above the floor. When the light is interrupted by the feet, the unit triggers a timer with a precision of 1 microsecond. The highest height was considered as peak vertical jump height, VJH, peak in centimeters. Performance test. This test was performed on a 200-meter indoor track and consisted of an individual 3,000-meter run. Participants were instructed to cover the distance as fast as possible and encouraged to maintain an even pace throughout the run in order to produce the best performance. Time was measured to the nearest second and considered as performance criterion, perf 3000 in seconds. Mean velocity over the 3,000 meters was calculated and divided by PTS to estimate aerobic endurance and in percent PTS. Training interventions. Endurance training. All participants, DWT, PT, and C, followed the same basic endurance training program that was typical to what they were already doing. It involved 2 high-intensity interval training sessions and 1 low-intensity continuous training session per week. The content of these training sessions is described in Table 2. Strength training. Participants of the control group did not train for strength, whereas participants of DWT and PT groups performed 1 strength training session per week. The strength training program was designed to improve maximum power, defined as the ability to produce a high amount of force over a very short period of time. Training details relative to the number of sets and repetitions were given in Table 3. Excuse me. Rapid improvements were expected because participants had no experience in this kind of training. Therefore, the 4th training session was dedicated to the adjustments of training intensities by the mean of specific tests. Participants of the DWT group were required to perform purely concentric semi-squats on a guided squat rack allowing only vertical movement, Atlantis-Laval, Quebec, Canada, and to move the load as fast as possible. This load was determined individually. It corresponded to the load allowing the attainment of P peak during the force velocity test. Average power through the whole range of motion was measured with an infrared sensor. Muscle Lab, Ergotest, Norway. See force velocity test for a more complete description. A trial was counted only if power was at least 95% of P peak, measured during the force velocity test. Otherwise, it had to be immersed. Feedback about power and validity of the trial was given at each repetition. Participants of the PT were required to perform drop jumps from 20, 40, or 60 centimeter jump boxes. Briefly, a drop jump consists of stepping down from a given height and bouncing as high as possible. The hands have to be placed on the hips throughout the entire jump. In our study, no specific instruction was given regarding the depth or speed of the counter movement. The height of the jump box was determined individually. It corresponded to the height that allowed the participant to reach the highest vertical jump height, supposedly the highest power. Vertical jump height was measured with an optical system, OptoJump microgate. See counter movement jump test for the more complete description. A trial was counted only if the vertical jump height was at least 95% of the maximum vertical jump height reached during the first or the fourth training session. Otherwise, it had to be recommenced. Feedback about vertical jump height and validity in the trial was given after each repetition. Statistical analysis. Standard statistical methods were used for the calculation of means, and SD's normal Gaussian distribution of data was verified by the Shapiro-Wilk test and homoscedasticity by a modified Levin test. All variables met these underlying hypotheses. A two-way analysis of variance, ANOVA, time times group, with repeated measures on the time factor was performed. Multiple comparisons were made with Bonferroni post hoc test. The magnitude of the differences was assessed by the effect size, ES, calculated according to the following equation. ES equals M2 minus M1 over SD pooled, where ES is the effect size, M1 and M2 are the mean of the first and the second trial, and SD pooled is the pooled SD calculated as follows. SD pooled equals the square root of S squared 1 times N1 minus 1 plus S2 2 times N2 minus 1 over N1 plus N2 minus 2, where S1 2 and S22 are the variance of the first and the second trials, and N is the number of participants. The magnitude of the differences was considered either small, 0.2 less than ES, less than or equal to 0.5, moderate, 0.5 less than ES, less than or equal to 0.8, or large, ES is greater than 0.8. Pearson's product movement correlation was used to evaluate the association between relevant parameters. The significant level was set at P is less than or equal to 0.05. All calculations were made with Statistica 6.0, Statsford, Tulsa, USA. Results. 7 participants did not complete the 8-week training program and were withdrawn from the study. The main reasons were illness, N1, lack of motivation, N equals 2, or injury, N equals 4. It is worth noting that none of the injuries occurred during the strength training session. We deplored an ankle sprain during hiking, N1, a minor muscular tears during a gradual exercise test, N1, or during recreational activity, N2. Final sample sizes were N equals 12 in DWT, N equals 11 in PT, and N equals 5 in C. These participants completed 97% DWT, 99% PT, and 100% of the C. All of the scheduled sessions, which reflects a high training compliance. There were no initial differences in dependent variables between groups. Body mass index, and the sum of skin folds did not change after the 8-week training intervention, Table 1, nor did VO2 peak or end, Table 4. The two-way ANOVA revealed interaction between time and group, P is less than 0.05, an effect of time for CR, P is less than 0.01, Table 4, whereas the power attributed to body mass, kilogram or kilograms to the negative 0.75, post hoc analysis allowed us to identify a moderate decrease in DWT, ES equals 0.62, P is less than 0.01, and a large decrease in PT, ES equals 1.01, P is less than 0.01. There was no improvement in C, ES equals 0.00, NS. Individual results are shown in Figure 1. We also found an interaction between time and group, P is less than 0.05, and an effect of time, P is less than 0.01, for P peak, Table 4. The addition of a weekly strength training session induced a large increase of P peak in DWT, ES equals 0.98, P is less than 0.01, and a small increase in PT, ES equals 0.24, P is less than 0.01. No differences were found in C, ES equals 0.04, NS. We found an effect of time for VJH peak, vertical jump height, P is less than 0.01. Both experiment groups improved VJH peak No differences were found for C. Perf 3000 increased moderately in PT and in DWT. Improvements in Perf 3000 were smaller for C. No correlations were found, by the exception of an association between initial CR and the percent change after the training intervention in experimental groups. R is equal to negative 0.57, P is less than 0.05, figure 2. Discussion. The aim of the study was to compare the effectiveness of two strength training methods. Matched for volume and intensity to improve CS or CR in male endurance athletes. We hypothesized that plyometric training would result in a greater decrease in CR because an improved storage recoil capacity of elastic energy. Our results partly confirmed this hypothesis. Participants of PT displayed a greater decrease in CR than their DWT counterparts, 7% versus 4%. It has to be mentioned that results from a recent article show that changes in CR greater than 2.4% can attribute to a training intervention rather than a testing error or day-to-day variations. However, we failed to find any relationship with the capacity to store and recoil elastic strain energy, as no correlations were found between changes in vertical jump height peak and changes in CR. It has been shown that VO2 does not increase in proportion to body mass during both submaximal and maximal intensity running. To avoid misinterpretations when comparing individuals with different body masses, such as children and normal or overweight adults, it is often recommended to express VO2 relative to the body mass raised to the power of 0.75, 1/16. In addition, to improve the validity of comparisons, this allometric scaling has been reported to decrease individuality variability, thus increasing statistical power. We made a sensitive analysis between CR expressed in milliliters per kg per minute or in milliliters per kg per minute, and found no reason to use the one approach instead of the other, because body mass was homogeneous as measured by a modified living test and not different between DWT, PT, and C. We finally opted out for a classical approach, i.e. body mass raised to the power of 1. A recent research examined the effect of plyometric training on CR. 8 moderately well-trained male endurance runners added 2 sessions of high-volume, low-intensity plyometric training per week during 6 weeks to their usual endurance training. The authors found a moderate decrease in CR. P is less than 0.05, ES is 0.46, whereas both end and as measured as by lactate threshold and VO2 peak remained unchanged. Other authors reported similar amplitudes of improvement after a 6 to 9 week high volume, low intensity plyometric training period in moderately to well-trained endurance athletes. In contrast to these reports, participants of the present study performed a low-volume, high-intensity plyometric training. Our result confirmed the positive effect of such training on CR, but with a much greater amplitude of improvement. It should be noted that these gains were obtained with only 1 session per week. It is far less than current recommendations or practices. A recent meta-analysis examined the effectiveness of plyometric training to improve vertical jump height, reported an overall ES of 0.84. The ES of the PT group, which was 1.01, underscore the undoubted efficiency of the method we used in the study that relied more on training intensity than training volume. We were not able to find a concurrent strength and endurance training study that used the same weight training protocol than ours. In a recent study, 7 well to highly trained triathletes added 2 sessions of low volume, high velocity, and high intensity training per week during 14 weeks to their usual endurance training. They reported a large decrease in CR, whereas end, as measured by the second ventilator threshold, and VO2 peak remained the same. These results were confirmed very recently. The authors found a large decrease in CR in 8 moderately to well-trained endurance athletes after high intensity, low velocity, and low volume training, strength training program 3 days a week during an 8-week period. In our study, participants of DWT performed a low volume, high velocity, and moderate intensity strength training that allowed reaching at least 95% of maximum power. This intervention resulted in a moderate decrease in CR. This amplitude of improvement was less than results previously published. Several factors that may have contributed to this difference. Current guidelines recommended 2 to 3 sessions per week to improve maximum strength. In this study, participants of experimental groups added only 1 session per week with their endurance training. It is possible that the overall training load was not sufficient to stress adequately adaptation process in the DWT. However, the large increase in P peak we observed in this group, which was compared with the gains reported in strength alone training studies, does not support this contention. Another possible explanation is that concentric maximum power per se is not a major determinant of CR. If such an association existed, the corollary of the high increase in P peak we found in WWT should have been a higher increase in P peak. We found that in DWT should have been a higher decrease in CR. The inverse was true because we observed an interaction that favors PT and found no association between changes in P peak and changes in C1. I'm reading that as R. Because they used the same movement and were matched for training volume and intensity, the main difference between DWT and PT was the type of muscular contraction. Although DWT was purely concentric, PT allowed for the use of a series of parallel elastic components and therefore had the potential for improving the ability of the muscle tendon unit to store and recoil elastic strain energy. However, we were not able to find any association between changes in VJH peak and changes in CI, nor the interaction between experimental groups regarding jump performances. Adaptations regarding the ability to use elastic energy and to develop more power probably differed between PT and DWT, but both contributed to the increased VJH peak. Therefore, it appears that the counter movement jump test was not sensitive enough in itself to underline specific improvements in the ability to store and recoil elastic energy. Another possible explanation could be related to the important number of factors influencing CI. It is possible that improvements in power and the ability to use elastic strain energy are not the only determinants that contributed to the decrease in CI. Indeed, some authors reported that changes in muscular stiffness and mechanical factors can influence CI. A limit of this study is therefore the lack of sensitive measures of those neuromuscular determinants. The inverse relationship we found between initial CI and percent change in CI suggests that already efficient runners did not take the same advantage from their strength training program than less efficient ones. Either their adaptation capacity was at its maximum, or more probably the training methods were used in the study were not adequate to stress it at a higher level. This issue has already been addressed. These authors assigned 12 novice and 14 varsity female rowers to either a low-intensity high repetition, H rep, or high-intensity low repetition, H load, strength training group. Performance at a 2,000-meter rowing ergometer test was recorded before and after an 8-week combined strength and endurance training period. Interestingly, the authors reported that varsity rowers who performed H load training demonstrated greater improvements in performance compared with those who performed H rep training. Inversely, H rep training was more effective than H load training in novice participants. Our results and these results concur with the hypothesis that the effectiveness of strength training to improve CI or performance is dependent on both training status and the characteristics of strength training load. The ultimate objective with athletic training is to improve performance. In this study, runners from the experimental groups and from the control group showed significant gains in Perf 3000, although these results were expected for both PT and DWT. Improvements for C are surprisingly considered that no performance determinants were modified. It should be kept in mind, however, the variability of VO2 max and CI explains roughly 70% of the variability in marathon performance. This means that other factors are involved that were not measured in this study, such as psychological variables and the use of other metabolic-anabolic pathways. Finally, although we found no interaction between groups, their respective ES suggests that the gains were higher in experimental groups and could have been significant with more statistical power. Practical applications. It has been shown that CI can predict performance for middle and long distance runners with similar VO2 max values. CI is influenced by a number of factors, including strength training and neuromuscular adaptations. The purpose of this study was to compare the effectiveness of 2 strength training methods matched for volume and intensity to improve CI in male endurance athletes. Our result confirmed that athletes and coaches should include in their practices a precise assessment of the CI to plan an optimal training program. Although it is well known that strength training represents an important intervention to reduce the prevalence of injury, our results show that explosive strength training, and more particular PT, is, moreover, a good intervention to improve CI. Therefore, coaches should plan a strength training periodization that emphasizes on these two components. Athletes showing the initial highest CI values will particularly benefit from explosive strength training. These positive adaptations can be expected after an 8-week intervention focusing on intensity rather than volume. For athletes with already low CI, interventions should focus on increasing training volume or intensity, as shown by the improvements in VJH peak and in P peak. Explosive strength training will benefit the runners by increasing their general athletic performance. Acknowledgements. The authors wish to thank Jerome Blias, BSSC, for the technical assistance. The authors have no conflict of interest and received no funding for this study. The authors have no professional relationship with companies or manufacturers that might benefit from this study of research. The results of the study do not constitute endorsement by any product by the authors or National Strength and Conditioning Association. No funds were received from this work from any organization. you.